Welcome to the debate. Have you ever just stared at a blank screen? Or maybe an unwritten business plan for like 3 entire years?
Oh, absolutely.
Right? And you feel nothing but this crippling, inexplicable self-loathing because you physically cannot make yourself start. You know exactly what you need to do, you have the skills to do it, and yet there's this invisible wall that just stops you cold.
Yeah, it is a universally maddening experience. When you work within a traditional corporate structure, the obstacles are usually external and highly visible. You lack a budget, you need a specific credential, or maybe the market shifts. But the moment you step into the void of self-directed creative work,
Exactly. Where you are the sole architect of your daily output. Those external barriers just vanish, and you are left entirely alone with your own psychological complexities. In that internal vacuum is exactly what we are dissecting today. We are looking at Stephen Pressfield's seminal work, The War of Art. It's a short, incredibly punchy book that has achieved massive cult status over the years.
it really has. It is widely considered a sacred text for digital creators, writers, and entrepreneurs.
Yeah, it was even highlighted as one of Ali Abdaal's top life-changing books.
Which is huge. Its influence on modern productivity culture, especially among knowledge workers, is truly undeniable.
So the central question we are debating today is this. Is conceptualizing our creative struggles as a literal war against an external malevolent force that Pressfield calls resistance a necessary, liberating psychological tool?
Or is it a reductive framework that masks complex psychological and practical realities?
I am defending Pressfield's framework. I argue that externalizing this creative paralysis as resistance provides a morally serious, highly pragmatic method to bypass our own excuses. It helps break through the shame of inaction so we can actually fulfill our potential.
And I am taking the other side on this. While I certainly acknowledge the initial, visceral relief of Pressfield's model, I argue that anthropomorphizing creative struggle into a literal enemy oversimplifies genuine psychological barriers. It demands a level of willpower that isn't always medically appropriate, and it relies heavily on unexamined assumptions of privilege.
Let's lay out the groundwork for how Pressfield gets to his core thesis. What makes the War of Art so potent is its empirical pragmatism. He didn't formulate this theory in an academic laboratory,
No, he really lived it.
He did. He spent nearly 3 decades working manual labor, driving tractor trailers, working on oil rigs, battling this exact paralysis daily before finally publishing his first novel at 52.
Wow.
Yeah. So the core concept he derived from that experience is that resistance, with a capital R, is an objective, impersonal, repelling force. It is not ordinary procrastination. It is an active energy that rises up to oppose any act that rejects immediate gratification in favor of long-term growth.
Right.
And crucially, he argues the intensity of resistance is diagnostic. The more important a calling is to your personal evolution, the more fiercely resistance will fight you. Recognizing this completely shifts the narrative. You aren't intrinsically lazy. You are engaged in an external battle.
Look, I understand the tremendous initial relief that comes from that metaphor. If a creator has been sitting in front of a keyboard feeling like a failure, the idea that an invisible force is to blame acts as a massive psychological release valve. It strips away the shame completely.
Which is incredibly liberating for people.
It is, initially. However, that metaphor quickly becomes problematic when applied as a universal law. Framing every hesitation, every pause, every block as a malevolent energy actively trying to destroy you dismisses completely valid functional reasons for creative blocks.
Like what, exactly?
Well, sometimes a creative block isn't a demon to be slain. It is a symptom of nervous system burnout, a genuine need to step back and process, or simply a lack of material resources. Pressfield sets up a strict, unforgiving binary between the amateur and the professional. I argue this ignores the practical, daily realities of most people's lives and borders on a reductive approach to human limitation.
But that is exactly why his definition of resistance is so vital. It is because it anticipates that exact argument. Pressfield explicitly points out that resistance is incredibly smart, right? It doesn't just show up as sheer laziness.
Right. He says it uses psychological warfare.
Exactly. It weaponizes our virtues against us. Think of resistance not as a cartoon villain, but as an overactive mental autoimmune system. Your brain biologically wants to conserve calories and maintain homeostasis. It views deep focused work as an expensive metabolic threat.
So it attacks that creative impulse.
Yes, using whatever white blood cells work best. If you are a deeply compassionate person, resistance will convince you that locking yourself in an office to build your startup is terribly selfish when you could be helping your family. It manufactures entirely rational-sounding crises that conveniently require your attention right when you were supposed to sit down to work.
Right, I hear that. But I come at it from a different way. What you were describing as resistance being smart is, in my view, a psychological sleight of hand. By categorizing almost any human behavior that delays work as resistance, Pressfield makes his theory unfalsifiable.
How is it unfalsifiable?
Well, he creates a closed loop. For instance, he specifically identifies things like the desire for healing as a manifestation of resistance. He tells the reader that claiming you need to heal your trauma before you can create is just the enemy talking.
Because he argues the creative part of us is deeper than our trauma.
I know, but neurologically, if your nervous system is dysregulated, your brain pulls the emergency brake. Pressfield calls that brake resistance and says you should smash through it. By labeling a deep psychological desire for healing as a trick of the enemy, we risk ignoring vital internal signals. We end up treating our own psyche as a hostile entity to be conquered, rather than a complex system to be understood.
But if you treat your psyche entirely as a complex system to be fully understood before you can take action, you will spend the rest of your life analyzing your inability to work. That is the trap.
Is it a trap, though? Or is it just responsible self-care?
Pressfield compares resistance to gravity. It is objective and impersonal. Gravity doesn't hate a bird, it's simply doing its job. Treating self-sabotage as a physical law of nature rather than a complex web of trauma is the exact pragmatic bypass required to break emotional paralysis.
I just worry about the collateral damage of that bypass.
But Pressfield famously states that most of us have two lives, right? The life we live and the unlived life within us. If we wait to perfectly untangle every internal signal before we write the code or launch the business, the unlived life goes to the grave.
The idea of the unlived life is poetic, and I do not dispute that self-sabotage is a tragedy. But let's critically examine his primary prescription for this problem. He insists that the only antidote to resistance is what he calls turning pro.
Right.
So how exactly does that mechanism work in his framework?
It works by fundamentally shifting your relationship to your output. Turning pro means treating your art or your side hustle with the cold, reliable discipline of a factory worker. The professional does not wait for inspiration.
They don't wait for the muse to strike.
No, they don't check the weather of their emotions before sitting down at the desk. They put their ass where their heart wants to be and they execute. The amateur waits for the muse, but the professional masters the technique.
It reminds me of that Somerset Maugham quote.
Yes, exactly. I write only when inspiration strikes. Fortunately, it strikes every morning at 9 o'clock sharp.
In a modern context, it's like being the CEO of a strict startup rather than a hobbyist. A CEO doesn't get to call in uninspired. They detach from the immediate emotional outcome and focus entirely on the execution of the process. Look, that's a compelling argument. But have you considered the material assumptions baked into that definition of the professional? Pressfield explicitly states that the professional accepts remuneration for their labor and stakes their livelihood on their work.
He does say that.
Right. He claims that those who don't stake their livelihood on it are amateurs. But what about the individual with 3 dependents and a mortgage? What about the person who literally cannot quit their day job because they need the corporate health insurance?
Well, I think you might be taking his use of livelihood a bit too literally there.
I don't think so. Framing those individuals as amateurs who are succumbing to resistance because they won't bet their financial survival on an uncertain creative endeavor is an inherently privileged perspective. It assumes a financial and social safety net that the vast majority of the population just does not possess.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective. Staking your livelihood in Pressfield's philosophy is not an instruction to recklessly quit your day job and starve in an apartment. It is a psychological posture.
A psychological posture?
Yes. It means you treat your unwritten novel or your unlaunched business with the exact same life or death seriousness that you treat the day job that puts food on your table. It means your calling isn't a peripheral hobby you do when you feel like it.
But he specifically talks about accepting remuneration.
Right, but when he talks about the professional accepting remuneration, he is emphasizing the psychological shift from doing something solely for internal, private validation, which makes you incredibly fragile and vulnerable to self-doubt, to treating it as a craft with objective value in the real world. The professional shows up no matter what because they treat the work with the gravity of a livelihood, regardless of whether it is currently generating a full-time income.
Even if we accept that highly charitable interpretation of his economic requirements, we still have to confront the psychological demands he makes. And this is where the framework becomes truly precarious for me.
Precarious how?
While Pressfield explicitly suggests that anxiety, self-doubt, and even clinical depression can sometimes merely be manifestations of resistance, he proposes that a significant portion of what we diagnose as clinical issues might just be individuals avoiding their true calling.
He does suggest that. Yes.
I find this medically reductive to the point of irresponsibility. Telling someone who is suffering from a chemical imbalance or severe clinical depression that their illness is actually just an insidious trick by a malevolent energy pathologizes their illness. It frames a medical condition as a moral failure of creative courage.
But he's attempting to write a psychiatric diagnostic manual, and it's unfair to read it that way. He is diagnosing a very specific, highly prevalent modern phenomenon, which is the despair of the unlived life.
But he uses clinical terms.
Sure, but there is a distinct, crushing anxiety that stems directly from knowing you have potential that you are actively wasting. When you have a calling you are running from, the cognitive dissonance creates a massive psychological toll. Pressfield is arguing that the anxiety of unfulfilled potential is a unique affliction.
Okay, I can see the distinction there.
Right, and for that specific type of depression, doing the work actually is the cure. The amateur believes they must overcome their fear and resolve their anxiety before they can begin the work. Pressfield's brilliant revelation is that the professional knows the action must precede the feeling. You start the work and the fear recedes as a consequence.
And on the mechanics of that, I actually agree. What you're describing is behavioral activation, which is a well-documented, highly effective psychological tool. Behavioral activation works because action generates dopamine, which in turn creates motivation.
Exactly.
Pressfield's amateur waits for motivation to magically appear so they can take action. The clinical reality is the exact reverse. You have to take the action first to chemically generate the motivation. My issue isn't with the mechanism of action, though.
Then what is the issue?
My issue is with the grandiosity of his framing. By treating procrastination as a literal demonic force, he elevates everyday task avoidance into an epic mythological battle.
So if behavioral activation, doing the work, alleviates that initial anxiety and generates momentum, that brings us to the biggest question. What actually sustains that action over years? Because once you break through the initial resistance, you need an operating system to keep going.
Right.
And this is where Pressfield shifts gears entirely into the third part of his book, Beyond Resistance.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why. In Book 3, he completely abandons the tough love empirical psychology we've been debating. He introduces angels in the abstract, muses, and unseen forces that supposedly enlist in our cause once we start working.
He uses that language, yes.
He pivots from a stoic, blue-collar, factory worker approach into full-blown, alienating spiritualism. He argues that the ego produces resistance, while the self, with a capital S, guides us toward our calling. This massive shift from sit down and do the work to invoking metaphysical entities undermines the very pragmatism that supposedly makes the book so effective. It replaces actionable discipline with magical thinking.
Now, if you're listening to this on your commute and rolling your eyes at the idea of angels dropping out of the sky to help you write code or launch a startup, stick with me. That's an interesting point, though. I would frame it differently.
How else can you frame literal angels?
Well, Book 3 is not a departure from pragmatism. It is the philosophical underpinning of why the pragmatism works. Let's look at exactly what he does with the concept of the ego versus the self. He uses this distinction to outline a highly practical framework for how we should approach our work, which is the difference between working hierarchically and working territorially.
Which, if we look closely, is essentially just intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation dressed up in mystical terminology.
I think it is much more profound than that because it attacks our evolutionary biology. Think about why humans default to hierarchical thinking. We are wired for hierarchy because for millions of years, tribal status meant survival.
Right, if the tribe didn't like you, you were cast out and you starved.
Exactly. Our brains are designed to constantly scan the hierarchy. Think of the ego like a social media algorithm. It is entirely reactive, built to measure likes, scan for threats, and adjust behavior based on external validation. The hierarchical artist is paralyzed because their biological programming is obsessed with how the work will be received by the tribe.
So how does working territorially counteract that evolutionary programming?
By operating from the self. Think of the self as the operating system running quietly underneath the algorithm. You don't get notification pings from it. It just executes the core code. When we work territorially, we ask only two questions. Does this work fulfill my own standards? And does it express my truth?
Okay, that makes sense.
A territory is something that sustains you, like a psychological home base. For Pressfield, his territory is sitting at the typewriter. When he is there, he is completely insulated from external judgment. He is fighting millions of years of evolutionary programming by refusing to look at the hierarchy.
It is a powerful concept.
This perfectly aligns with why so many modern knowledge workers appreciate the book. It stands in stark contrast to superficial, feel-good productivity or hustling for external metrics. Pressfield is arguing that the ultimate goal of the work is not to shape ourselves into a shiny ideal to impress the hierarchy, but to find out who we already are and become it.
Shifting to an intrinsic focus is incredibly valuable. Removing oneself from the anxiety of the hierarchy is a sound, scientifically backed strategy for maintaining creative stamina. However, my critique remains that muses and angels are a conceptual leap that many logical readers simply cannot follow.
Even if it's just a metaphor?
Yes, because it demands a spiritual buy-in that contradicts the earlier premise of resistance as a blind, objective force, like gravity. Gravity doesn't require angels to function. By requiring the reader to accept that unseen forces will magically assist them if they just show up, Pressfield risks setting up the amateur for even deeper disillusionment.
Disillusionment when they put in the grueling hours and the angels inevitably fail to arrive, you mean?
Exactly.
But the angels do arrive, functionally speaking. They arrive in the form of deep flow states, serendipitous connections, and the compounding returns of focus work. Pressfield is simply using the language of the mystic to describe the neuroscience of focus.
I just think that language is unnecessary.
But it captures the feeling. He observes that when we show up consistently, something mysterious happens to our cognitive processing. You don't have to believe in literal guys with wings to experience a phenomenon where, after staring at a complex problem for 4 hours, the solution suddenly presents itself entirely intact.
As if it came from outside your conscious mind.
Right. The metaphysical language is just a vessel for a very real, very empirical experience of the creative process.
But describing flow states as angels is precisely the obfuscation I am warning against. If we are aiming for an accurate, sustainable understanding of our psychological mechanisms, clarity is essential. When we mysticize our successes as the work of muses and demonize our struggles as the work of resistance, we abdicate our own agency.
I don't think it's an abdication at all.
It is, because we strip ourselves of the nuanced self-awareness required to actually manage our energy, protect our boundaries, and optimize our cognitive load. We need profound intellectual humility when approaching our own minds. We must be able to discern the mechanical difference between a self-generated excuse and a genuine, practical limitation.
I would argue that aggressively stripping away the excuses is the very purpose of the book. As we look at the whole picture, I maintain that the enduring power of the war of art lies in its unapologetic moral seriousness.
It is definitely morally serious. I will give you that.
In a modern culture totally saturated with life hacks, software optimizations, and endless productivity planners, Pressfield refuses to treat creative work as a cute hobby. He frames it as an existential battle.
Right, where the unlived life within us is not just a missed opportunity, but a profound tragedy.
Exactly. The book's brevity proves he doesn't waste the reader's time with fluff. Every paragraph is a targeted strike against our rationalizations. Consistent, professional execution, completely detached from the whims of inspiration or evolutionary fears of the hierarchy, is the most reliable mechanism we have for becoming who we are meant to be.
And I will reiterate that while the motivational power of externalizing resistance is undeniably potent for a certain demographic, it is a framework that requires a massive dose of caution.
Caution regarding the mental health aspects?
Yes. We have to recognize the profound biological difference between overcoming laziness and ignoring deep nervous system distress. We must acknowledge that not everyone has a material security to stake their livelihood on a creative whim, and failing to do so makes them a responsible adult navigating reality, not an amateur.
That is a fair point of contention.
The concept of resistance is a brilliant behavioral tool, but it should never become a totalizing worldview that pathologizes genuine human limitation.
Well, it seems we find a strong point of convergence in acknowledging that self-sabotage is a very real, tangible phenomenon, one that requires rigorous, conscious management, regardless of the exact terminology we use to describe it.
Absolutely. Whether you view it as a malevolent mythological force trying to keep you down, or an evolutionary quirk of the brain desperately seeking metabolic ease, the tragic result of inaction remains exactly the same.
Exactly.
The paralysis is deeply real, even if we fundamentally disagree on the nature of the architect behind it. The blank page will remain blank until an action is taken to generate the momentum.
Which means there's so much more to explore in the source material for anyone wrestling with their own creative blocks. We suggest that you dive into the war of art yourself to evaluate your own relationship with the resistance, holding back your unwritten screenplays, your unlaunched businesses, or even your difficult conversations.
Returning to where we began, the corporate ladder may provide a comforting, visible structure, but when you step into the void of independent creation, the obstacles become invisible.
We leave it to you to decide whether you are fighting an external enemy or simply navigating the incredibly complex internal map of your own mind.